Welcome back, everyone, for another super special live episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast here at EDUCAUSE in Nashville. Having a great time. We are kind of halfway through the first day here. So, I've had a couple of great conversations already if you're following along, but this one will be really interesting. Certainly kind of scratches my itch of talking about kind of like hardware, audiovisual stuff, but I think getting a little bit more tactical on how institutions can really kind of optimize their potential when it comes to teaching and learning in the classroom and how kind of, technology blends into that. So we will start off as we always do. If you want to introduce yourself and your background, talk about your role, and then we'll get into the rest of the topic.
Amazing. Thank you. My name is Gaurav Bradoo. I am the head of product and portfolio at Logitech, focused on our education vertical. And what that means here is our goal is to improve the teaching and learning experience for educators, faculty, AV teams, and IT teams, as well as, most importantly, the students with the tools that we make so that it becomes simpler in today's modern day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just, for any of the organizations that are here, I like kind of capturing all the aspects of like how you all are showing up, kind of like, what's bringing you to EDUCAUSE, like anything you want to highlight about kind of Logitech being here at EDUCAUSE this year.
Yeah, for us, I think the big thing that we've been sort of thinking about over the last few years, diving much deeper into higher education, has been how learning is changing and evolving, and sort of how it flows from an individual student and educator at their desks or on campus or at home learning, but how does that scale into the classroom? And so we're really showcasing our solution sets across that, but more importantly, talking about the learnings that we've had, working with institutions before we even put pen to paper, and our solution sets derived from the actual institutional knowledge, as opposed to us sitting in our ivory towers and saying, this is how you should do tech.
Yeah, I think there's always just a great vibe and feeling when you're here, when it's just like everybody kind of coming together, the folks that are just, purely kind of digital tools and platforms, the hardware, the instructors, the instructional designers, the support staff, like all the people kind of coming together, learning and connecting and dialoguing and engaging with one another. Because I think, it's certainly what we try to do on this podcast is, just throughout all our episodes, respect sort of all the kind of bits and pieces and nuts and bolts that go into, higher education institutions running and operating effectively and efficiently, and inside the classroom, outside the classroom, all that good stuff. So appreciate you kind of coming on to, again, bring in sort of the different unique perspective here. And I'm going to put a question to you that is, very lofty, very open-ended, very broad. Take it as you will. What do you see as emblematic of a modern learning environment?
I think, again, this is what we're learning from the institutions themselves, and sort of our synthesis of that work is that modern learning environment is everywhere. It's in the classroom. It is in the sort of student sort of hallways of the dorms. It is in any place where you have access to being able to sit down and learn. And the same thing is true of the teaching experience. And what we're seeing is that the technology both needs to catch up to being able to allow for that to happen. And, the educators and the institutions are figuring out how to catch up to that, because the students are doing what the students are doing. So that, I think, is probably the biggest shift that we're seeing, that there's this expectation from the students coming in that let me learn everywhere. How do we enable that? That's basically one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I do think that is just been this kind of undercurrent. I mean, we've talked about in previous episodes the idea of like, institutions don't exist in a vacuum. So like the world impacts higher ed impacts the world and stuff. But like that idea of like the sort of dynamism of like learning where it's, on demand, flexible, the different modalities and, things being fully in person, fully online, hybrid, like, so there's a lot of things there. And I think it is just, the sort of adaptability and flexibility, but certainly accessibility, and I'll kind of get to that too. But like, I think students being able to learn in the way that's going to be best for them. So it's that idea of what I've always appreciated is, as you create more varieties of learning content, it could be, if it is obviously just a video, you can watch it 20 times, or you could watch it at 1.5 speed, or you could, whatever, or engage with like the transcript, or it's certainly now with like AI, like take certain pieces. If it's like, you just kind of getting summaries or recaps or something with it, the idea of just like, I need this presented to me in a different way, and whether the institution is sort of serving that up directly, or the student now has all these different, tools in their tool belt that they could use to kind of carve out and kind of craft the learning experience to where, ultimately they're submitting, hopefully a assignment that is fully generated from their own thoughts and things, that like the path and journey they took to get there could be obviously so unique and different, and just at least kind of acknowledging that and honoring that from kind of the institutional perspective. But certainly with, Logitech, I at least want to kind of give honorable mention to sort of the aspect of what you all do in terms of hardware, because I think so much of our conversations anymore are about sort of these, digital platforms, everything sort of being, out in the cloud and the ether and online or whatever. But just your experience, I guess, just sort of working with institutional leaders as they're thinking about how their modern learning environments kind of show up in physical spaces, and just any anecdotes, I guess, from where we're at in this current moment when it comes to like the actual physical spaces that foster, teaching and learning.
Great question. I think we're seeing, like I said, I think on one axis, if you think about teaching being how complex the content needs to be, and then on the other axis, how much scale do you need? Like how many students are accessing that content in the live moment? You sort of end up with this graph or 2x2, so to speak, where you have very large spaces. We're talking, 200, 300 person auditoriums that have been AV equipped for a little while. And they needed a level of complexity because you're trying to automate and design for a bunch of different things. However, most of the spaces at sort of institutions are smaller. And yet there's this idea that that complexity that brings this supposed flexibility scales down. But what we're seeing is that isn't the case. It's far easier to scale up from simple solutions to go up, as opposed to scaling down complexity. Because we've seen from the institutions that are sort of taking this pathway that when they go down from a large sort of complex experience and try and scale it down, you're doing a lot of what ifs in your scenarios. Whereas what the institutions will talk to us in terms of the ones who are deploying this, we had one case where an institution was talking about they wanted to install a camera for lecture capture. And traditionally, cameras of that kind usually require power, and then they're running data all the way through, very sort of specific. For them to add another power outlet next to the wall where the camera was going to cost more and was going to be more time consuming than running a category cable to where the podium was, where your AV rack is, to be able to have power and data over Ethernet. And yet they wanted the simplicity of a USB camera. They didn't want the complexity of a networked camera, because if you're teaching those things. So for us, it was like I needed to hear that feedback, because we were saying, hey, we've been designing video systems in the enterprise space for desktops for about a while. How do we solve this? And that conversation was sort of very eye-opening. And then we had many like it, to sort of have this scenario of like, how do I make this simple and yet expandable? And so that's what we're seeing, this tension of institutions saying that I want to have solutions that are simple and yet scalable and also interoperable, because it would be hubris for me to think that everything is done in one place. It takes a village to solve this, both on the hardware side, on the digital side. And so the solutions that sort of work with each other ultimately are the best experiences. And we should be allowing, we've heard that we should be allowing institutions to be able to grow in that way, and yet build on modern sort of applications of video, modern applications of sort of digitalization and lecture capture, as opposed to the legacy systems as your starting point. That flip, we're seeing institutions make that choice to then sort of have that distinct movement of once they've moved to that, it's a very clear sort of journey in that direction. And then you sort of move into that simple pathway and you don't go back, because you're then seeing the rewards from piloting those examples. I was just at another conference last week where we were having this discussion around piloting with your faculties, being able to do that. Again, the institutions were telling us that, yeah, we're finding that being a mechanism where we can learn and then expand that out and then only roll that out in that way. So it's been amazing to hear that.
Yeah, and for the sake of time, because I think you're sharing just amazing context there for just sort of the dynamics here, and like, I think for any of these conversations we're doing kind of the quicker hits in person, like I have to resist the temptations to like follow, like, go down the wormholes and stuff. But I think, yeah, I mean, at least does just honor the, all the variables at play as institutions are continuing to kind of interface with digital transformation, which can be happening as much in physical spaces as the purely kind of virtual and digital ones. But I think the kind of segue to my next question, I think kind of what I was sensing and hearing was the idea of needing to at least, bring intentionality and kind of critical thought towards like the accessibility, sort of like how easy to use and sort of like, gain traction will this solution be? And it might be that we have to kind of go away. That seems a little bit sort of windy to get to a place where it's like, this is going to be easier for any faculty to just drop in, use and take advantage of, versus it being like, what we think is the best or whatever solution
Totally.
or, whatever. So on the student side, I
Mhm.
think that's, kind of what I was alluding to a little bit before, but the way that I thought about this question, I thought would be very interesting. Can I get your take on is balancing standardization with the need to create, accessible course content and stuff. So like,
Mhm.
because there's always going to, I think, be that sort of temptation and allure of like just, copy paste, like carbon copy,
Mhm.
just sort of like do the template and whatever else. But like you need accessibility for as many on and all learners as possible and everything. So just any sort of perspectives or anecdotes that you have on interfacing with that sort of dilemma.
100%. In fact, again, in that journey of like, when we're sort of talking about this idea of learning everywhere built around what the institutions have been telling us, this thought that video ends up being a critical part, audio ends up being a critical part, but the enablement that it gives you is both for your synchronous learners who are in the physical room, in the moment, who can take in the content in a very different way. We were just, talking earlier about this, that note-taking has fundamentally changed. I know that if the lecture is being streamed and recorded, I can do two things. One, I know that it's going to be captured later, so I don't need to take notes in the same way that I was before, where it was just transcribing. Transcription is being done. We've seen students now timestamp their notes. And then even if they're sitting at the back of the class, they can log in through that video experience and be able to see the professor and the content, switch between the views, get a transcription and a translation at the simultaneous time, know they can review the content. And that's just for the person who was synchronous. I had to take care of my mom. I have to take care of my child. I have to go out of day for a day. My options are the templatized version of the content or the recording of my live class with my peers, where that discussion has value. We're hearing about modalities of learning where a classroom got too full and you have overflow spaces where instead of me joining, like at that situation, the traditional pathway was I would now be a remote student. But now I can go in with 4 or 5 of my peers into a meeting room, join and have that group discussion. So we're seeing literally the scenarios where they're having a group discussion, muting the room and being like, what did the professor say? Did you understand that? And then unmuting and having the sort of voice of the room as opposed to the vulnerable voice of the individual. And so that dynamic is becoming really fascinating to see that what we were seeing in the meeting world is flowing through into the teaching and education world. And it's just more human and natural. And ultimately, that's the goal, right? Like I want, like my dream is that two things, we've laughed about this, is at the podium, the laminated data sheet goes away because things are that simple. And over time, people don't remember that my product is my product. It's like, I want them to be in the state of flow. Like the only person who should know about my product is the procurement person. And ultimately, when the teacher's done with the lecture and they're like, oh, that was simple. That's the sort of dream and that's the sort of goal. And that sort of accessibility pathway for students to be able to learn in the moment, after the fact, being able to learn from more engaging content. And for us to do a better job of making it easier for faculty and for the institutions to make the content more engaging. So even in desktop scale, we're saying the classic pathways for you to be able to be on a webcam, record yourself with your slides. But if I'm teaching you something like geography, and I need you to sort of experience what sort of trade in one part of the world does to another part of the world, have a globe. We've got a camera that you can demonstrate with. And now leverage AI not just in a way that is sort of more static. We've sort of been running these experiments where with the vision capabilities of some of the AI solutions, bring in that feed and sort of leverage that as a thought partner. And now you're creating more engaging content without the tools getting more complex. It's still as simple as joining a web call to record a webinar. Hopefully that answers.
No, absolutely. Because I think what it says to me is that like there's like a harmony here where like these are not opposing goals. It's that idea of like you're saying like we have a classroom where the teacher goes to teach that is set up to stream it and capture it and that sort of thing. Like it's just, that is a bit of standardization, which can then enable accessibility in the sense of like, yeah, if I need to tune in remote, I can do that. If I want to, like you said, sort of grab bits and pieces of this to use as I need to, I can do that. But like, and I think that is just like, thankfully, yeah, like we kind of companion of like hardware and software, like AI and everything. Like everything is just sort of like coming together and coalescing to enable this, where it is sort of like you can standardize the creation of accessibility or something, like, and I'm trying to put kind of my thoughts together here clearly, but like, I think it is just like, it's exciting to hear you kind of talk about that. And even things that I didn't think of, that idea that you could have like the best of both worlds of a remote, but group session, a part of the class. And it's just like, yeah, like you almost just need to like, and I always get like, going to check myself thinking that this is very like cheesy or whatever, but just sort of like, we just need a little sense of imagination, like that idea of like, the idea that you can have this sort of, again, perfect storm of all these tools as institutional leaders. You now can like start to kind of ideate and have some imagination as to what can, create the most accessibility and how can you really try to embed standardization that enables the accessibility. So that captures exactly what I was kind of, I think, not even fully imagining myself. I guess that would be the answer, is that like there probably is that notion that those are like opposing goals of like standardization and accessibility, but we're increasingly getting to that moment where like it's not on, the onus is not on the individual learner to be like, I need this, I need that, and those sort of things. We can just create a much more on-demand, user-friendly, choose your own adventure, sort of aspect of learning. Yeah,
even if your modality is singular, right? Like one of the big stresses that we've seen institutions have is like, hey, do I now have to do all of these, I have to allow hybrid? It's like, even if you were planning on being just completely in person, having the video, having that just extends your ability to teach. It's not like you suddenly have to jump to a different modality. But if you're already in those different modalities, then having that sort of helps you. But even as you're sort of wetting your feet into this pathway, you can do it. And as I said, our biggest learning has been like having the institutions, like the AV teams, the faculty, the students co-create, and where they're sort of able to talk with the vendors to help sort of vet and design with that in mind. That co-creation is ultimately the sort of pathway to success, both financially as well as experientially.
Well, I will give you kind of the final word here. Advice, calls to action, further resources, however you want to take this, of just sort of, how you want to kind of wrap things up for this episode for listeners to kind of have some inspiration and motivation to go out into the world and tackle these challenges.
I think the biggest thing when we were starting to do this research was we thought this was going to be classroom of the future or learning of the future. But the exciting thing for me was that this is now. It doesn't need to be complex. It is simple. The systems are scaling. And like I said a moment ago, it just takes co-creation with your, like listening to your leaders, to, your own intuition, and sort of working with the vendors and, your integrators to say, how do we come up and solve these problems? And sort of going through that journey with your institution. And, hopefully Logitech is a part of that. But even if not, we want to make sure that you're ultimately getting the best experience for your learners.
Yeah, and I think that's even just maybe like the comfort, because I think there's been kind of implicit in our conversation that there's going to be a lot of like, I think, institutional variable, because I think just what we were saying about like, oh, we have to put this outlet in or whatever, like if it's like this like 300-year-old institution with a super old building, like there's going to be so many different dynamics at play as institutions are navigating digital transformation. So that's not the idea that there's in any of this the one only way about approaching it. It's just that idea, like you said, like you would hope to, if nothing else, kind of encourage folks to do that sort of like co-creation, the thinking, imagining the sort of whatever else, and figuring out how do we get there versus, I think, limiting yourself and thinking like we can't do it, whatever else. But because I think that's the way that, that I've just been certainly refreshed by certain institutions really getting kind of bold and rethinking like who they are as an institution and, how they can live out their mission, especially if they've like been around for a really long time, but they're maybe now starting to be like, maybe we just need to be either like mostly online or just say fully online or whatever else, like just, it's just that idea of like, we can still live out our mission in a very different way than our founders maybe could have ever imagined. But I don't know. So I think that is a beautiful way to end the episode. We'll have ways to connect with you and Logitech in the episode description, but just thank you so much for hopping in here, a little impromptu, and for sharing all that you did.
Thank you for taking the time.